Hey everyone, it's Blake, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about cross-examination strategy. So, cross-ex is a part of the LD round that I get a lot of questions about, and it's always difficult to answer because there's not really a science to cross-ex, it's more of an art. And I can give you general tips and some guidance and rules of thumb, but really CX is just something that you have to learn through experience. So think of this as a bird's eye view overview of CX strategy. But it's definitely something that you learn through experience. But I'm going to do my best to provide a quick overview of strategy that can be used during the cross-examination period. So first, I just want to start with generally good cross-ex practices, things that make cross-ex go or run a little bit smoother. Cross-ex is the point in the round that there is the highest risk of things getting disrespectful or uncivil because it is the part of debate where you are directly exchanging sentiments back and forth one to one. So some tips to keep things more civil. Avoid looking at your opponent. It's less awkward than staring at them and asking them questions and stuff like that. And it helps keep things civil. The general rule of thumb is you should be facing forward or towards the judge during cross-ex. This is something that kind of went away after COVID. Like, I guess during COVID, we weren't telling students to not look at their opponent because there's no point. And then we came back from COVID and everybody was staring at each other during cross-ex and it was awkward and things would escalate and things like that. So try to bring things back towards this norm to make things run a little bit smoother. An important note about cross-ex is that CX is binding, but it's not an official speech, meaning things that you say in CX, you are obligated to stand by it. Like you can't change what you said in cross-ex. If you said an argument means a certain thing and then you said it means something else in a speech, that's like against the rules. But it's not a speech. So just because your opponent said it in cross-ex does not mean that it is part of the judge's evaluation. You still need to bring it up in your actual speech, like say during cross-ex they admitted this, in order to, if like what they said sets up an argument, right? So cross-ex is binding, but it is not an official speech. If you want to use something that they said in cross-ex to set up an argument, you have to bring that up and say that they said it in cross-ex in the actual speech. Some good practices for when you're the one asking questions: make sure that you are asking a question, not making an argument. So a lot of times people will ask a question, the opponent will respond, and then they'll just be like, right, but that doesn't make any sense because blah, 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 blah. And that's not a question, right? CX is a questioning period. So make sure that you're actually formulating questions. It doesn't count to just say, that doesn't make any sense because blah, 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 right? Or wouldn't you agree that that doesn't make any sense because blah, 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 blah? Those aren't questions. Those are arguments. You're not actually inquiring. You're just throwing a couple words at the beginning or end to meet the requirement of it being a question. Cutting off an answer. It's always good to have some phrases in your pocket for how to do this smoothly and respectfully. So if you're changing topics, you can say something like, all right, that makes sense, thank you. But if you're asking a follow-up on the same topic, something like, sorry, I'm still unclear, let me be more specific, or let me ask in a different way. Because there will be times when your opponent is going on and on with an answer, but they're not getting to what you want them to get to. So you need to gently be able to redirect them or get another question in without being disrespectful and cutting them off forcefully. When you are answering questions, one of the things that's a big pet peeve of mine as a judge, and I know many other judges feel the same way, is when somebody rambles and tries to run out the timer during cross-ex and get the other person to ask as few questions as possible. Don't do that. The judge knows what you're doing. It doesn't, come off as strategic or anything like that. It just comes off as kind of cheap. So make sure that when you're answering questions, try to be concise and don't just try to run out the timer. So now let's talk about more specific strategy considerations when you're the one asking questions during cross-ex. So I kind of think of cross-ex questions as existing in a hierarchy where the best kind of question you can ask is one that sets up a strategy. The most simple or least useful kind of question you can ask is just a clarification question. And then somewhere in the middle, there are these implication questions. And these aren't perfectly all-inclusive categories. There are questions that fall outside of these, but these are kind of the three big general flavors of cross-ex questions. So let's talk about each one specifically. So first, the bottom of the hierarchy is these clarification questions. They're totally acceptable. Most rounds have clarification questions, but they should not be the majority of your questioning period. So clarification is more like, what did you say in your second contention, or what did you say against my second contention, or could you explain this framework to me, or things like that. Times when clarifying questions are important. When there are important texts like plain text or interpretations, you want to make sure you got the exact wording correct. So could you repeat the plain text word for word, something like that. If you want to get an explanation for a weird framework or method you don't understand, ask them a question like, could you explain the framework to me in your own words? Don't be afraid to be direct about it. Say, explain it to me like I'm 5 years old. That's a good way to be direct and cut to the point, instead of setting it up like, what does the framework look like, blah, 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 because then your opponent is just going to throw in all the jargon and words that were confusing in the first place. Whereas if you hold them to some kind of criteria, like in your own words, or explain it to me like I'm 5 or something like that, they have to simplify their language or they're not answering the question. Clarification questions are also important for diving into unique and complex link stories. Don't be afraid to make your question just why, right? So if your opponent says, banning lethal autonomous weapons is going to collapse the economy. Why, right? That is a link story with a lot of steps. It's not an obvious connection. So why is that connection there? So clarification questions are very important, but they are not going to do much in terms of improving or setting you up for strong argumentation in the next speeches, but you have to understand what the case says in order to go against it. So they're necessary, but they shouldn't be the majority of what you're doing in cross-ex. The kind of middle of that pyramid are the implication questions. So some examples of what implication questions would be is like, how do I weigh under the framework? Or what does this mean for how the round is evaluated? Basically saying, I'm not asking what the argument is. I'm asking what the argument means for the greater context of the round, right? So these kinds of questions are important for understanding potential strategic preempts in the AF, or understanding how you're going to do weighing or impact analysis, basically doing the finer points of what your analysis is going to look like. Implication questions are a part of a practice that we call minesweeping, which is basically when you are looking for any tricky things in the case that make you less likely to win, right? So examples of tricky things are like an argument that says, the negative debater may not read any advocacies, or something that says, you automatically affirm because the resolution says resolved, so it's already happened, right? So there are little tricky, blippy arguments that can be independent voters for the AF or for the neg. So these implication questions, pointing those things out and asking what they mean for the context of the round, is a good way to minesweep or detect where those pitfalls are. So for example, you could ask a question like, are there any independent pre-fiat reasons to vote for the affirmative or vote for the negative? So that's basically saying, is there anything you're doing in the round pre-fiat, meaning before the resolution is implemented, anything you're doing in the round that means that you win the round? You could also say, is there any argument that I could read in the NC that would trigger a theoretical concern established in the AC? Basically, did you say that I can't read anything, or am I able to read whatever without triggering a theory argument? So minesweeping is a really important part of the implication questioning. But it's still, implication questioning is still not the best type of questioning that we can use our time on. The best would be strategy questioning. So these are questions that lock in a link. So something like, who implements the AF? And they say the federal government, and then boom, you have a link to a K. Or set up a framework indite. How do we ensure that all people follow util? And then they give you an answer, so you know you can be more specific with your bindingness argument that you make. Or strategy questions can also make your opponent give away their strat. So what is the status of the counter plan, right? Like, what is your ultimate vision for how this round is going to go so that I can preempt it and lead it in a different direction? Now, asking strategy questions is a fine line because you want to set up a strategy without giving away your strategy. Try to think ahead as to what your opponent is going to assume based on the question you ask, and ask questions in a way that could be potentially leading them down the wrong path. So instead of asking a question like, why is Kant preferable to util? Because obviously that's indicating that you're going to get up in your speech and read util, right? That's telling your opponent that they can take the time to prepare for that and start thinking of arguments right away. Instead, you could ask something along the lines of like, how do we ensure that people follow Kantian ethics, right? So it's not tipping away what your strategy is, but it is setting up your strategy still. You don't want to ask questions like, wouldn't doing the AF actually cause X? Like, wouldn't doing the AF actually collapse the economy? Because obviously they're just going to say no, and now they know that you're going to make an economy argument, and so they have a lot more time to come up with arguments for it. Same thing goes for questions like, wouldn't you agree that blah, blah, blah? Because they're just going to say no, and you've already tipped your hat too much, and they know what you're going to say in your speech before you even say it. So strategy questions are in my opinion, the best use of cross-ex time because they can really solidify your strategy and make it waterproof, airtight, and whereas the other questions just kind of set you up for potential understandings or like lay the groundwork for your strategy, this actually locks in your strategy, makes it effective, makes it harder for your opponent to get out of your strategy. So when we are asking trap questions, this is a subset of strategic questions that I call trap questions, that are basically questions where no matter how you answer them, it sets up a strategy, right? So in my head as the person asking questions, I'm going to ask this yes or no question, and if they say yes, I'm going to read a certain case, and if they say no, I'm going to read a different case, right? And I know what those cases are. So for example, I could say, do you defend implementation? And if they say yes, I know that my dissad about implementing the policy destroying American politics, I know that that link is locked in because they're defending implementation. And if they say no, they don't defend implementation, I have a theory shell prep that says that they have to defend implementation. Or another example, if I ask a question like, who is going to oversee the implementation of the AF? Well, if they say the federal government, I can read a 50 states counterplan that I have prepared. If they say independent states, I have a T-shell prep that says that, the United States refers to the federal government. Or if they say a private third party, I have an econ dissad that's specific to private investors, right? So having a big repertoire of potential arguments, especially as the neg, it is really helpful because you can ask these trap questions where no matter what they say, they are basically conceding a link to some kind of argument, right? And so these trap questions are really kind of like exemplary of what really effective strategic questioning can look like. So here's just a couple of examples of questions that you should always ask. So in certain scenarios, there are questions that are absolute musts. So if it is a framework you have never heard, you need to ask, how do I weigh impacts under your framework? Otherwise, all of the impact analysis you do is just going to be a waste of time because they're just going to get up and say, that doesn't apply to my framing. So you have to ask how you weigh under their framework. If there's a lot of dense analytics in the case, or if a K is read, you have to argue, you have to ask, are there any independent pre-fiat reasons to vote AF or neg? Because those dense analytics and Ks are the arguments that most often lend themselves towards having like one line that means the AF automatically wins, or this card says that if you make this argument, you have to lose the round, right? So asking questions like, are there any pre-fiat reasons, independent pre-fiat reasons to vote AF or vote neg, are a good way to detect those and kind of take the wind out of the strategy of those arguments. Because remember, cross-ex is binding, so if they say no and then try to extend something as an independent pre-fiat voting issue, then you can get up in the next speech and say CX is binding, they went back on what they said in cross-ex, you can't evaluate that argument. If the neg reads an advocacy, you have to ask, what is the status of the counterplan/alt? Check out the conditionality video for more information on what to do with the answer to that question. I'm working on the conditionality video right now, so if it's not available yet, it will be available soon. And if multiple types of off-case positions are read, say they read T theory and they read T or theory and a K, you have to ask what layer comes first. Does K come first or does theory come first, right? Because that tells you what you need to spend more time on. So these are just a couple of scenarios where there are absolute must-have questions in your cross-ex period. This is not an exhaustive list. There are other scenarios where there are mandatory questions, but that would be the subject of a whole nother video. Answering questions. So when you're answering questions, I just have a couple of general tips. The first and most important is to be honest. You want to sound good. You want to come off as, not linking to your opponent's argument or setting up yourself to make clearer extensions or whatever, but you also don't want to misrepresent evidence. Like if your opponent is asking you a question and the answer is very obviously yes based on the evidence, just say yes and prepare for the implications. Don't lie and misrepresent the evidence, because that just reflects poorly on you from the judge's perspective, and the judge probably won't even buy the argument anyway. When you're answering, give concise and direct answers. Rambling and trying to run out the timer just annoys the judge, frustrates your opponent. Trying to use a ton of jargon to confuse your opponent does the same thing. Just be concise, be direct, be understandable. Don't let your opponent force you into simplifying an answer to the point of misrepresentation. It's pretty common for somebody to say, ask a question, and then the opponent starts to respond and they say, it's a yes or no question, yes or no. You can still provide a more nuanced answer because the situations we discuss and debate are nuanced situations. So just call out your opponent for doing that. Say, you're trying to oversimplify a very complicated scenario. Allow me to explain it, and you'll get your answer, right? So if they're really trying to push you into yes or no or whatever it is, don't be afraid to push back and argue for your right to have nuance. A few other tips: try to anticipate the strategic implications of what you say. So if they ask if you do something, don't just jump to what sounds obvious, right? So if they ask, do you use the federal government, and you didn't read anything in the app that says you do use the federal government, that means that you have the ability right here, right now, to make the decision whether or not you do that thing. And so a simple yes could set up a lot of neg arguments. Instead, try something more nuanced, like, we utilize the infrastructure of the government to implement the app, but we do not endorse the state as good, right? So come up with nuanced answers. Don't just jump to an obvious answer that could potentially set up a strategy that you are not prepared for. And remember, questioning in LD is unilateral, so when you are the one answering a question, you should not ask a question of the person who is questioning you. That is just a general good practice. And the main job of cross-ex is damage control. The person asking questions is trying to poke as many holes and set up as many strategies as possible. Your job is to make sure that they can't do that. So knowing your case well and knowing common arguments against your case is absolutely essential. So some final thoughts about cross-ex strategy. Cross-ex should be respectful. This is really, really important. A lot of times people get kind of sassy or disrespectful or less civil during cross-ex because of that back and forth oppositional nature of it. That should not be happening. Do your best to maintain kind of a level-headed composure when it comes to cross-ex. Cross-ex is unilateral, so if you're the one answering questions, don't ask a question. And if you're the one asking questions and your opponent asks you a question, say, this is my questioning period, or I have a question for you, or redirect it in some sense. Don't get caught answering questions when it's not your job to answer the questions. CX is for questions, not arguments. So if you are the one who's supposed to be asking questions, don't just be making statements, right? That is a misuse, a less effective use of your cross-ex time. CX is binding, but remember, it's not an official speech. So what you say, you are locked into, but if it's important to the strategy, it needs to be mentioned in an official speech. Don't ramble or waste time. It just comes off as irritating to the judge and frustrating for your opponent. When you are the one asking questions, clarification questions are less valuable than implication questions, are less valuable than strategy questions. So try to allocate your time in a way that reflects those values. And lastly, both sides should be trying to think a few steps ahead so that they can ask questions that set up strategy in effective ways, or answer questions in a way that don't give away their strategy or don't absolutely give away a link to the AF. So um, CX is a really fun and engaging part of the debate, but it's also one of the most challenging because you have to do this thinking ahead. So that's just something that comes with time, but it's really, really important. So do your best to try to think about the implications of what you say and ask before you say or ask it. And that's all I have for this video. If you have any questions, let me know or leave a comment or whatever. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.